Call Chris Farfoy.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. Can I try and pick up where Tracy Martin left off, because I think she used a very good example of where postings that I don't think anyone in this House would like to see online are made, but where the devil in the detail in this bill, on this side of the House, while we're going to be supportive of this bill at this stage, doesn't quite meet up with the responsiveness that we would like to see in the bill. Because yes, Miss Martin, the complainant in this case could go to the approved agency and make a complaint, and if the approved agency thought that complaint was valid, they then have a process where that complaint is sent off to the author or the person who posted it, and there's a 48-hour potential window for the author to respond. Now, if the author then responds at the very last minute, they then have 48 hours to put a response, a substantive response together. So we have a situation where it would be 4 days, potentially, before that post came down. Now, that on our side of the equation isn't responsive enough in a digital world where things go up damn fast, and at the moment we don't see quick responses to posts that no one wants to see there. So to have a post up there for potentially 4 days, as this legislation allows under the safe harbour measures, isn't fast enough, we think, and is something that we have raised at various stages, including the select committee stage, I must add, to make this legislation as good as it can be and responsive as it can be, and therefore effective as it can be. Because, as people know in this House, 4 days is a long time before the internet was around. So to have a 4-day window for these damaging posts, obviously causing harm, because the legislation says that that needs to be triggered before the complaint can be considered, is a hell of a long time. It's a very long time under this legislation, and we would have liked to have seen, and maybe the Minister and the Chair or the Minister responsible for the bill may be able to answer this, why the government didn't consider something that could be almost instant takedown as soon as the approved agency meets those tests that Ms Martin spoke of before, to make sure that less harm is done, or the least amount of harm is done, to someone who makes a complaint. Because it's harmful whether it's up for an hour, and it gets increasingly worse if it's up for 4 days. Because in the digital world, the author can put it up and that can be taken down, but if someone takes a screenshot, which is easy to do, that can be spread on and on and on. So I understand that this is a difficult one to try and tackle, but if we're not being as responsive as we possibly can through the processes through the approved agency during this bill, then while we do reluctantly support this legislation, we believe that is one of the areas where strong opposition should be put up to make sure this piece of legislation can be much, much better. And we do think this legislation could be much, much better, Mr Chair. And when you look at the process, and I think just the way that it's presented to this Parliament, I think I've got the SOP in front of me in my hands, roughly about 22 pages. The legislation before us is 22 pages. And I think that tells an interesting story, Mr Chair, about, and most of those changes are particular to Part 1, Mr Chair, about how this process hasn't really been the ideal process to make sure we're getting the legislation right. The government should have engaged more with parties right around this House. It had the opportunity, and I think Claire Curran has made this point, to engage more with community, especially young people, to make sure we get the legislation right. And Mr Chair, we would argue that while something needs to be done in this area, the legislation isn't as precise as it could have been. And I do want to make the point that there is an SOP from the leader of the ACT Party, David Seymour, into Part 1, where he wants to delete Clause 19 for the very fact that we don't, he thinks, and I think David Parker made the point, that Clause 19 was a bit too vague, a bit too broad, and could catch what some people would think would be reasonable behaviour as illegal behaviour, Mr Chair. And in the SOP that Mr Seymour has put to the House, it is much more... Mr Chair? Mr Chair?
Chris Farfoy.
Thank you, Mr Chair.
The only one standing.
Well, thank you very much for that. The odds were in my favour. Mr Chair, I think the SAP put before the House excuse me, by David Seymour is much more precise and will catch some behaviour which we all would think abhorrent. It's not behaviour that is out of the realm of thinking. I can think of a couple of instances in the last couple of weeks where this has been relevant. And I would like to thank David Seymour for putting it forward, because we think this is the kind of measure that could have happened if the process had been much better, Mr Chair. There are some pieces of the legislation, Mr Chair, that we do think are reasonable. I think being able to use the internet providers to identify people who are anonymous, I think that's clause 17. I'll go trying to get a nod from Claire Curran. That sounds about right. Because a lot of the harmful comments that are being made are by people who use pseudonyms. They're not man or woman enough to use their own names. Keyboard warriors, as my colleague Penny Henare says. So we're going to be able to use this piece of legislation for IPs to go and say, well, let's figure out who this anonymous person is, so they can actually front up and we can hold them accountable under this process. So I think that's a good thing. One of the things that frustrates me about social media, whether it be Facebook, more often than Twitter, is you get these people who don't use their real names and under these pseudonyms they're as tough as hell, but they get away with murder. And I think one of the things in this piece of legislation is that we can go and figure out who these people are. Mr Chair, I did want to just finish by saying that we believe this is a necessary piece of area of law that needs to be addressed, but we're quite upset that the government has chosen to use a process that it has taken. It could have been much better. The process could have been much better. They've taken the chance to have a crack at opposition parties through this process. They haven't worked cooperatively and collaboratively, and I think we suffer as a parliament and as a country because the legislation before us is not as good as it can be. And in this age of social media and connectivity, we owe it to people to make sure we get it right. And on this occasion, while we support it, we don't think it's as good as it could have been.